As a part of the conversation series that is taking place in the early part of 2025, as we continue with the work for the organ and for opening up the south door in the church towards Jermyn Street and St. James's Square beyond. It's a real joy to be in conversation with a number of people in and around the life of St. James's, each of whom bring their own unique perspective. And today I'm here with an artist, a Royal Academician, whose experience of St. James's is unique because of the perspectives that she brings. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Anne Desmet, and it's a real delight to be here. St. James means a lot to me, largely through the RA Summer Exhibition and the annual services for Royal Academicians and all the exhibitors in the summer show that happens, which is a joyous moment in the year for me and many other academicians, I'm sure.
So every year for this service for artists, which takes place on Varnishing Day, everybody gathers in the courtyard at Burlington House and there's music and all sorts. And I would love to hear about the impression that you have over the years of being part of that. Imagine what it's like from your point of view to know that you have work on the walls in the summer exhibition. It's a sunny day, hopefully, in June, and you gather in the courtyard. What's it like? What happens next from an artist's point of view?
Well, for years I was one of those artists, long before I was elected an academician, so getting your work accepted for the summer show, was an absolute joy. So I have got both perspectives as an artist selected and later as an academician where my work is automatically in the show. But it's a joyous thing, I think, and mingling with that crowd in the courtyard of the academy, who are all marching off, processing off to church. It's grand, and I'm. Yet there's just a sense of real joy in the air and anticipation and of being part of something that's this fixture of history. And I think that the church's part in that. I'm rather, I can't say I'm a great believer, I'm something of an agnostic, but this one church service is special and precious and celebratory about the importance of the arts and the importance, what that says about the human condition, of why we're all here, and the good that we can bring to the world as individuals and as a group. And I just love that sense of this mass celebration full of artists, some of whom will be religious and plenty of whom probably aren't, but are all there in this spirit of celebration that happens here in this church. It's wonderful.
And there are hundreds and hundreds who come together year by year. And I'm thinking about that energy and the spectacle, even the pageantry of everybody coming down the street along Piccadilly and then flooding into the building. And I'm always curious about these kinds of almost psychogeographical maps of London. So on the one hand, you've got your streets and you've got your buildings, but then you also have just the flow of people, where people are naturally drawn, whether in ceremony and ritual or just having a walk and ambling along, where people's favorite spaces are in their city and why, and the difference between purposefully going along in community and just having a wander, perhaps in order to be inspired or clear one's head or connect with beauty in a different way. And I am really thinking about that now in light of this south door, which Christopher Wren initially had and planned in the 1680s and then was bricked up over 150 years ago and is now in a different way with Ptolemy Dean's architectural design, which is kind of responding to Albert Richardson's design for the church after it was bombed in 1940. Richardson was our architect, so he put his own mark on the church, his own spin on Wren, also really trying to integrate his design with a sense of modern classicism. He was moving backwards through time, forwards through time. And so the one thing that Richardson never got to do was a south door because it was already bricked up. It wasn't going to happen. He was he was in no position to be and we're going to bring this door back. There was plenty else to do just to make sure that the church was restored as much as possible, but again with clear glass and all of these changes, things made new as well as contextualized in their heritage. So it's almost now as though Ptolemy's work is extending the new forms of classicism layer on layer and opening up these new routes, which are also ancient roots in and around through this neighborhood, through this parish and all of its institutions and people over the last almost 3.5 centuries. It's a long time. So then let's imagine this. Let's imagine perhaps that you spent some time at the National Gallery and it's a sunny afternoon. Let's keep the weather nice. It's a sunny afternoon and you decide to come up along Pall Mall and then you come up into St. James's Square. Perhaps it's a weekday, so you can go through the square itself and admire the trees and the grass and watch people who are just, eating their lunch or picnicking and having a lovely time in the grass. And as you come through, you see the south side of St. James's, and that south door is there and it is open. What does that look like in your mind's eye? How might you imagine that experience?
Well, I think that would be a wonderful experience, but I almost would rather imagine it from inside the church, because a south door would presumably, sunlight will pour through that door, I think, and bring a sense of joyous natural light into the church in the way that I'm imagining Christopher Wren intended it. So I think that's joyous. And the sense of walking in the footsteps of people from 300 odd years ago who would have taken that route and would have entered the church that way is this lovely sense of circularity in history and bringing it back to Wren's original intention. But the bringing of light, south light, sunlight into the building is just magnificent.
A lot of your work as an artist, and very kindly you brought this beautiful publication to share with me earlier, and it's from an exhibition called Time Sequences. And a lot of your work as an artist, because of the technique, but I suppose also because of the kinds of interests you have, work with deep contrast between light and dark and architectural features, either detailed or in a broader way, whether it's Brooklyn Bridge or St. Paul's Cathedral. I wonder, from your point of view in the art that you make, whether you'd like to say a little bit more about light and the relationship between light and architecture.
Well, I mean, as a wood engraver, the whole process of making wood engravings involves kind of carving in light in the wood. So everything that you carve is going to be the paper white parts of your final print, and everything you leave uncut will be the black areas that assuming you're inking in black. And I find that sort of philosophically just a very beautiful way round that you are carving in light, you're creating in light. And also the process of wood engraving, it's quite labour intensive and quite slow, so you've got a lot of time for your ideas to evolve and change, and maybe you end up with something that wasn't quite what you first imagined because you started working on this complex engraving a couple of months ago and your ideas have evolved and changed. Or you can make one block do many things. You can print it at different stages and make different interventions with it so it has different aspects. So yes, the St. Paul series of mine that you just mentioned was intended to span about 12 hours during the London Blitz, evening to the following morning, through 5 blocks of London during an air raid, and what that might have felt like, and yet using contemporary images of St. Paul's in combination with ideas of the history of London and its bombings, which of course affected St. James so drastically.
And so many other Christopher Wren buildings
absolutely.
As well. So in
yes.
a way, at that time, even though it was bomb damaged, the almost resilience of St. Paul's as a symbol of London hooked Christopher Wren and Christianity, especially in this part of the country, to a quality of resistance or endurance, perseverance.
Indeed.
Perhaps. And the idea of these spaces, these consecrated churches as epicenters of the sacred in and around London, as little beacons of light themselves, is quite a beautiful thing. Or perhaps on an evening, the light that shines from within, like a lamp that then guides us through the city in different ways, in times of peace as well as conflict. And at St. James's, even though we're right in the middle of the city, like the Royal Academy, we think a lot too about the interconnectedness of all living beings and the natural world in its most expansive sense. And Grinling Gibbons was constantly exploring that. In the Reredos at St. James's, we've got abalone shells and pomegranates, birds in flight, and these swirls based on, I suppose, acanthus leaves or other sorts of growing living things that seem to defy gravity. And when we were looking at the font in the church earlier, we were also thinking about all of these different layers that he uses in order to, say, carving into marble, describe a distant city with these teeny tiny millimeter and centimeter marks. And at the same time, to really be very chunky in his approach to the material for the tree that Adam and Eve, and indeed the serpent, are all connected with at the base of the font, turning the font into a kind of a tree itself. So with all of these different natural imagery moments at St. James's, these symbols, especially with Grinling Gibbons' work, I'm casting my mind back to the work that you've done with razor clams and the way that time and these beautiful, fragile, as well as quite sturdy, sort of scooped out objects, the way that time manifests itself in the way that you arrange those objects and then worked with them, and how that relates to London's architecture as well. So it's seashore and shells, and it's also architecture in London through time. What was that project like?
Well, yes, a lot of my work has been to do with the passage of time and what that might say about ourselves as human beings. Architecture seems to me often a very good way to express that, because as soon as you put a figure in the work, the hairstyle, the clothing and all of that immediately dates a piece of work and fixes it in a very specific moment in time. But buildings, because they kind of expand, contract, or evolve in various different ways, are redeveloped, it's hard to place exactly what the timing of a particular building in an image is, and yet it can say so much, I think, about the passions and the concerns of former generations of people that extend and apply to us today. So razor shells have been one surface on which I've collaged pieces of my wood engravings, because they seem to be able to convey a sort of that sense of a passage of time, but also of great fragility, the things that we take for granted, you know, our huge buildings in London, our wonderful structures, and yet everything is so fragile and should be cherished, not just the buildings, obviously the people more particularly, but St. Paul's seems a great survivor of so many centuries, and not least the Second World War, but became a beacon of hope for people. And so that was a subject of a particular piece of work of mine on the razor shells, but sort of for that reason, that it's a building that has been inspiring for many, many generations of people, religious and otherwise. And I think St. James has a strong relationship with that. And in fact, I think it's miraculous that you tell me that most of the Grinling Gibbons survived unscathed when the church was so badly damaged in the Second World War. I mean, that's extraordinary that survived. That delicate wooden carving that you would have sworn would have gone up in flames when the church was bombed, you know.
Yeah.
Just amazing, miraculous that it didn't.
And some of it was sort of taken elsewhere and protected, but a fair amount of it was just, it had to be in place.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was very much in place and then got dreadfully wet and then had to kind of dry out and then be reworked and restored over years was the organ. So the Renatus Harris organ from the late 17th century. It had lots of work done to it over the years. There was a big project with it in the 19th century before the war. And the Grinling Gibbons organ case, it remains. It too is a kind of a steadfast survivor. And recently, as part of our project here at St. James's, all 3,000 of the organ pipes have come out. And so now we have this organ case with Grinling Gibbons' angels from the top removed with their trumpets taken out of their hands for safekeeping. And they are, I almost think of them as being in hibernation. They're sort of resting until the return and the revoicing of this beautiful instrument where we'll have this almost community of pipes and the amazing sounds that they can make return to the building changed. And for now, and probably for the next couple of years, if our project rolls the way that we expect it to, we have this case that is empty. And when we looked at the case together earlier, I really thought that your perspective, especially in light of what we've been speaking about with fragments and with history, it just really made me see it differently. So when you were looking at the Grinling-Gibbons case earlier, what was your view? What did you see? What did you think and feel?
Well, yeah, I saw a building with sort of empty windows and doors and a ladder up the middle that looked to me like an echo of the Second World War, of bomb-damaged buildings, very much so. Both because it's black and blackened, and these empty gaps within it, but very much an architectural structure. So it did seem as though it was harking back to that time in its history. I thought it was rather a wonderful empty shell. I mean, it's disturbing as those sort of recollections would be, but fascinating that it suddenly becomes a building rather than a case for the organ pipes.
Yeah, you've put into words something that has rested within me in an uncanny way that I couldn't quite place. And what I'm interested in as part of this is that we now have on the west end, above what's currently the main door into the church, this empty case, a sort of micro-architectural shell that's declaring the absence of its contents, if I can put it that way. And then right on the other side of the church, we have this beautiful Grinling-Gibbons carving with the pelican in piety, this mother bird feeding her chicks in this woven nest right in the middle with two doves either side, and all of these amazing fruits, flowers, vegetables, shells, all sorts. And they surround now two empty spaces. And those two empty spaces are where the commandment boards used to be. And that space has had a number of different things in it over the centuries. And we still have those old commandment boards. Often the way that it worked in churches from this period and a bit later, you can see lots of them in the city of London as well, is that you'd have the Ten Commandments on one side, and then you'd probably have the Our Father prayer on the other.
Yeah.
And so you've got all this text and the summation of the law of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament right there next to the altar, and then surrounded by this carving or whatever. And we still have them up in the gallery. So they too are kind of, floating free, untethered from where they used to be. And as someone who, in your work, you start with a wooden surface. That's where you begin. And so I wonder, almost in a sort of mystical, maybe, if you want to take it there, or a metaphysical or a philosophical way, we have all of this Grinling-Gibbons wood carving surrounding these two empty surfaces, the spaces themselves with the grain of the wood, creating a kind of abstract, all surface, all depth kind of moment. It frames sort of a present absence. I wonder what you think of that you have this surface which is just in itself and also maybe waiting for something or longing for something in the past.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd probably need a bit more time to think about that. But in terms of working with wood, a thing that is fantastic for me about the wood that I work with, which is boxwood, is that to have a largish surface on which to work, the tree has to be hundreds of years old, and that is because the tree is so slow growing that it takes that long to get a substantial piece. So you're working with something that has this age in it anyway. Although these days many of the wood blocks I work with are actually composites of lots of smaller pieces, because the older woods were all used up by wood engravers of the past, and newspapers printed pre-photography full of wood engraved illustrations. And I've even heard a rumour that some elements of boxwood were used in shell casings in the First World War, which is tragic if so, because these are trees that were hundreds of years old and just destroyed to make to
Used
make
as
bombs.
weapons.
Indeed, yes.
So trees
Terrible.
being pressed
Yes.
into these violent
Yes.
systems.
But when I'm working with wood, I'm working on end grain wood, so the grain isn't affecting my carvings. But I can see all the tree rings, so I could potentially count the rings and know how old my pieces of wood are, and so it will be boxwood or holly or lemon wood, which is nothing to do with lemons but is a South American wood. Maple is another one, but it's got to be an old tree that's got its own history to it. So it feels important to do something worthy with it, to sort of honour the tree as well as making some lovely image. It's not a material you feel you could just sort of treat casually and throw away. There's something precious about it, and often the shapes of these curious pieces of wood that I use might themselves inspire the image, because they don't always come in a straight rectangle. You get beautiful roundels, but relative to the scale of your altar, they're very small. But there's still this immense sense of the passage of time and the history of the wood there that you have on your altar, framed by the Grinling gibbons in a slightly different way. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I didn't know that about the material that you work with, some of its history, some of its character, and choosing to make your own mark in relation to the history of that wood and the tree that has grown and where it has been and what it has experienced season by season. It reminds me of a work of art that's here, actually, very, very simple and quite graphic. And it's just up there. It's by an artist named Ben Wildflower, and it's this cut through a tree where you can see the rings, and the inner section of text says, "There was life before," and the outer section of text says, "There will be life after." And so the relationship between wood and time is something that I really cherish, but that I hadn't really thought about in relation to St. James's, and especially in relation to the organ case and what's happening to it, and how this is a different time in its life where we can learn, we can experience it in a new way. And so finally, I have one more question for you. And it's because here we talk a lot about this space being a space of hospitality and rest and imagination. It's a place where we hope that people of any background or belief could imagine the world to be a different place, to be a better place. And so I'm curious about what you think, from your own point of view, the relationship is between imagination and the sacred, or imagination and the idea of something being holy or divine, even imagination and some sense of sacred presence.
Oh, that's a big question. I don't think I know quite how to answer that, other than to say that walking into a place like St. James is, you have a sense of that you need to pause and regroup and leave some of the everyday cares that you've probably brought with you through the door at the doorstep. Now, whether that's to do with it being a church, or whether it's to do with the architecture of it, or the sense of history of it, or the sense of its peace and enduring qualities and its stillness, that I can't say, but it does definitely have that effect, that it gives you a slightly different headspace to contemplate, or not, simply just to be peaceful and have a moment of calm, and to reflect on the way the light falls in the building, and if there's lovely music playing, to listen to that, to focus on the Grinling gibbons that is so joyous and so full of life and yes, plants and animals and vitality, all of that. But it's perhaps it slows down time somewhat to be in a place like this, is what I like, particularly because life has got so frantic and busy, mostly for all of us, especially in London, that yes, stepping out of that for a minute through these doors is, yes, to enter a slightly different realm for whatever reasons. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's
certainly, and it's really evocative of what it might be like for you in a holistic kind of way, all senses, body, mind, spirit, heart, and what it might be like for others too, no matter who they are, no matter why they're there. And each day we pray here, and one of the things that we regularly pray for is everybody who comes, especially people who don't know why they come, to just be present. I am so grateful that you decided to come today, to be part of this to be part of this conversation, to take a look at the church together, and to talk about, as we began, the delight and the joy of the connections between the Royal Academy and St. James, especially at the Varnishing Day service. And so I greatly look forward to that in June, and to seeing you amongst the artists whose work will be on the walls at the Royal Academy and will be celebrated here. Thank you for the conversation today.
It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.